Alright, so there's been tons of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth news hitting the internet, tons of articles that we've gone over, but there's one article in particular that is making the rounds that has caught my eye because it raises a very important question about a specific Final Fantasy VII spin-off that we gotta talk about. So if that sounds interesting to you, feel free to click the like button, subscribe. Let's be a little nicer to the subscribe button. Let's hit it with a Cure 3. We've been hitting that button super hard all week since Tokyo Game Show started. So let's be a little nicer. If you'd like to stick around with my channel, because we're going to be talking all things Final Fantasy and other things here and there like Resident Evil and some fighting games from time to time. So this article that's been making the rounds is from The Guardian, and in it they sat down with Yoshinori Kitase, Tetsuya Nomura, and Naoki Hamaguchi. And I'll leave a link in the description below because it is a very fascinating read that kind of covers the beginning of 7 Remake, but also even the OG Final Fantasy VII and how they're approaching the newer games with some of the older teams as well as the newer people that have come on board. And one of the first things they talk about is how Tetsuya Nomura actually got involved with Final Fantasy. He says, "Originally I was a monster designer. When I wrote out proposals for things to get into games, they were handwritten, and I'd put a load of little illustrations there to show what my thinking behind them was. I remember co-director Mr. Sakaguchi saw one of my proposals and looked at the character illustrations and said, 'You should be doing character design,' which completely changed the course of not only Nomura's life, but Final Fantasy in general. Regardless of how you feel about Nomura's designs, you can say that they're pretty iconic. They might be divisive and include a lot of belts, but the guy clearly knows how to design interesting looking characters. And without him in this franchise, it's kind of hard to imagine what people like Cloud, Sephiroth, and even characters from later iterations would even look like. Nomura just has such a unique style when it comes to designing these characters that it's really hard to imagine him not being involved." Now, moving forward, they talk about what it took to remake Final Fantasy VII instead of going the traditional one-to-one remake route and trying something a little bit different. Nomura says, "There was a number of successful remade games out there, and looking at them and how they turned out, I realized that if we just made a better looking version of the original game, it probably wouldn't have become the scale of project that it is, and it probably wouldn't have worked out. To get people interested and give players the motivation to play through it again, we needed to change Final Fantasy VII and add in new elements." He pauses, "to make Remake what it should be, rather than just sticking to the original." Now this is something we've talked about in previous videos because there's a lot of people out there that just wanted that one-to-one remake of Final Fantasy VII, and they weren't really too keen on the idea of changing story stuff or even updating the battle system. They just wanted a better looking OG Final Fantasy VII, or something in the vein of like an Octopath Traveler. But being a game designer has got to be incredibly difficult, and I imagine doing the same thing you did 25 years ago is probably not going to be very fulfilling. So taking a risk in changing things in regards to characters and narrative and battle systems and even the music is a pretty big step, but as designers, it's got to be very fulfilling to experience that. And being a fan of Final Fantasy VII, I really appreciated all of the new stuff that they put into Remake, as well as their approach. I do know the original story, but having new things pop up within the narrative that make me question, wait a minute, is this going to play out the way I think it is, or is something new going to happen, is something I really enjoyed because it keeps that experience feeling brand new and fresh, instead of, oh, I know scenario A is going to happen, which leads to scenario B, but now we've got a completely new scenario popping up in between those two to shake things up. And I personally really like that. And of course, when you make big changes like that, sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. The reception to 7 Remake, however, was mostly positive, so I think that it was a gamble worth taking at this point. Up next, they talk to Naoki Hamaguchi, who is a newcomer to this entire remake project. And this is a guy that grew up a huge fan of Final Fantasy VII. He goes on to say, "I'm very happy to be a part of it. As a fan who played and enjoyed the game back in the day, I think I bring a different approach to the project. I was looking at how we can remake it for the modern audience from a fan perspective, which is quite different to the original creator's perspective. I can't say that there is no pressure to get it right, but I think the enjoyment, satisfaction, and fun of actually being able to work on Final Fantasy VII overshadows all of that. And based on what we've seen so far from Hamaguchi, I'm gonna sound like a broken record, this guy just gets it. He knows what makes the original Final Fantasy VII so wonderful, and he's clearly a very big fan. And what's really cool about 7 Remake and Rebirth, and even a game like Resident Evil 2 Remake and Resident Evil 4 Remake, is that the one thing all of these projects have in common is their teams are made up of people who worked on the original games and people who grew up playing those games who then became developers. Resident Evil 2 Remake and Final Fantasy VII Remake in particular was literally lightning in a bottle, where they had both generations, people who grew up playing it and knew what made those games great, and that younger generation, they're familiar with modern gaming sensibilities and what makes new games so great, but also the people who created them in the first place. And having that is super rare in this industry. And again, it's lightning in a bottle. And you clearly see how big a fan Hamaguchi is, because he's still keeping the spirit of the original Final Fantasy VII while also adding in things that he knows fans will enjoy. And you see it within the world building, the exploration, and even the mini games. They're going all in on the mini games for Rebirth. And it looks super exciting, and it's fun, and it's still fresh while maintaining that Final Fantasy VII identity. Up next, we have the controversial topic of the term JRPG, which I did a video on a few months ago. However, it was from the perspective of Yoshi P, and he was not a big fan of that word. He viewed it as derogatory. And here they ask Nomura and Kitase how they personally feel about that term. Nomura responds by saying, "I'm not too keen on it. Certainly when we started doing interviews for the games that I started making, no one used that term. They just called them RPGs. And then at some point, I can't exactly remember when, people started referring to them as JRPGs, and I'm not really sure what the intent behind that is. It's just always felt a bit off to me, and a bit weird. I never really understood it, or why it's needed." However, Kitase kind of has a opposite view of that by saying, "Personally, I don't see it as that derogative. I think obviously with modern gaming, titles developed in the West are the majority now, so if JRPG is only used in terms of differentiating, maybe showing off a slightly different approach to games or a unique flavor in terms of Japanese-made games, I'm absolutely fine with it." Now, I'm not Japanese, but Kitase's explanation is kind of how I always viewed the term JRPG. Sure, there were RPGs growing up, but JRPGs were just a little different. They stood out more. They had more of an anime aesthetic. The music was different. Their combat systems were different. The overall themes were very different than what you would find in a Western RPG. Overall, what the Japanese developers have produced, it really stands out. And for them to kind of have their own genre, I think is kind of a good thing. But I see where both of these guys are coming from. Now, here we have probably the biggest bomb that they drop in this interview, and it comes, of course, from Nomura. Well, they were talking about the story of Rebirth, and Nomura happens to reveal that Advent Children fans will be well catered for by saying, if you play right through to the end, it will link up to Advent Children, so you don't need to worry about that, he says with a knowing smile. Nomura, you goddamn cryptic, riddle-spewing a-hole. So, in a video I did quite some time ago, I don't even remember what video it was, but I proposed the idea of imagine playing Remake Part 3, and the game supposedly ends when we beat Sephiroth and the planet is saved. But instead of credits rolling, it flashes forward a few years in time, and now suddenly the true ending of the game is Advent Children, and that's what we're playing. And how we're going to end up to the events of Advent Children is very interesting, because obviously they're taking some new twists and turns with Remake and Rebirth and whatever Part 3 is going to be, but the crux of the story, the main story overall, is most likely going to stay the same. So it makes sense for Advent Children to pop back up in this timeline and have us kind of do a do-over. And that's kind of the cool thing about what's happening, is that so many people have proposed the idea, and this is the one I tend to believe in, is that there are multiple timelines going on with the Remake trilogy. You have the original events of Final Fantasy VII, which include the spin-offs and Advent Children, but then you have the Remake timeline. And when you finish Remake, you realize, holy crap, this isn't just a remake, it's a sequel to the original Final Fantasy VII, just a slightly different timeline, where OG Sephiroth has somehow found a way to, post-Advent Children, maybe bring himself back and start manipulating time and messing with timelines and destiny, all in his favor, and a timeline where he forces Cloud to shake a dad ass at the Honeybee Inn.
Keep it up, Cloud!
The man is a menace. Which reminds me, I need to go back to the store and buy a new corkboard and some new red string and tacks because my current one is getting filled up. So it makes sense for something like Advent Children to still come into effect in this new trilogy. How Advent Children's gonna play out though, how different will it be? Will Zack now be involved in that specific story? Because obviously certain things, certain characters have to do certain things in the 7 Remake trilogy in order for Advent Children to come to fruition, but it's going to be very intriguing to see what exactly Nomura means when he talks about linking up with Advent Children. Because the idea of getting to play through Advent Children but making it with better writing
dilly-dally, shilly-shally
has me very, very intrigued. That is the video. I am Curious Corduroy. Let me know in the comments down below, what did you guys think of this article, and what in particular do you guys think about Nomura's quote in regards to Advent Children linking up with this new remake trilogy. I will see you guys in the next video. Please remember to always be excellent to one another.